Jax's revenge domain. I was heading back from the secure vault when Danny Torres, the night security guard, stepped directly into my path like he'd been waiting there for an hour. The kid was maybe 25, still green enough to let his nerves show. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "They moved your workstation into conference room Alpha. I don't think you should go in just yet." Victor Sullivan, 47 years old. That's who's telling the story. Danny didn't elaborate. Smart kid. His eyes darted toward the reinforced glass doors, and that told me everything I needed to know. I stepped back and positioned myself near the emergency exit alcove, silent, alert. The facility's climate control hummed louder than usual, like it sensed trouble brewing. I adjusted my scotch glass, the weight of it familiar in my palm. Old habits. When things go sideways in this business, you hold on to what's real. 12 minutes later, the blast doors cycled open. There he was. Ryan Foster, pressed cactus, polished Oxfords, clicking like a countdown timer, MBA from Wharton, still fresh on his LinkedIn profile. No badge lanyard, no humility, just arrogance wrapped in a $3,000 suit. He walked into Conference Alpha like he owned the federal contract and tapped the presentation remote. First slide materialized on the classified display. My slide. My exact security framework, even my embedded signature still glowed in the corner metadata like a digital ghost. Ryan started talking. Same cadence I used in Pentagon briefings. Same tactical progression I'd refined over 5 years of defense contractor work. He even mimicked the way I structured transition protocols between security layers. But this wasn't imitation. This was theft. My compliance matrix wasn't public domain. It wasn't on shared drives. The only way he had that content was if he'd breached my secured partition, which explained the 3:47 a.m. credential alert I'd flagged that morning. I'd spent the last 5 years developing a dynamic infrastructure hardening system. Threat assessment, penetration protocols, fail-safe checkpoints, all housed behind military-grade encryption on a license held not by the company but by my consulting firm, Sullivan Defense Systems. And this MBA consultant in Italian leather was parading it around like he'd built it over a weekend. I didn't storm in, I didn't make a scene. I just sat on the reinforced bench and opened my secure tablet, accessed my audit vault, downloaded the intrusion trail. Every token session, device fingerprint, and authentication handshake from the unauthorized access. At 3:47 a.m., someone had used my elevated credentials from inside the facility. Not remotely, not via secure tunnel, physically inside the perimeter. The badge logs would tell the rest. But I didn't need to play detective. I'd already tagged that account with breach protocols. My system, like me, didn't shout. It documented, it time-stamped, it waited. Back in the room, someone chuckled at one of his tactical jokes. One of mine actually lifted straight from a Joint Chiefs briefing 8 months ago. I wondered when this had stopped being professional theft and started becoming amateur theater. He was selling expertise to a room full of people too lazy to verify the source. But someone was about to verify. When you operate under a federal custodial license, like I do, access logs don't just stay in digital shadows. They whisper to compliance officers. They ping federal auditors. They trigger silent clauses most executives never bother to read. Mine included Clause 14C, which wasn't just about breach. It was about impersonation under federal contract. So I waited, calm, focused. Scotch glass steady in my hand, tablet in the other, watching the countdown, watching the storm form in silence. I didn't even shift position when he said my name. Victor Sullivan's framework laid the operational foundation for what I'll be demonstrating today, Ryan announced with a smile like he'd gotten my blessing that morning over coffee and handshakes. I almost rotated my glass. Victor Sullivan's framework, like I was some theoretical predecessor and not the person sitting 50 feet away, nursing 18-year-old Macallan and resisting the urge to snap my tablet in half. He didn't glance at the signature. He didn't acknowledge the classified disclaimer embedded in the slide metadata. He just moved through my protocols like he was auditioning for a promotion already gift-wrapped by his sponsor's office. His voice wavered slightly when he transitioned to the penetration testing section, because that wasn't his territory. The framework wasn't just bullet points and color-coded threat matrices. It was interconnected timing logic, intrusion detection controls, fail-secure thresholds, concepts that don't make sense to people who think cybersecurity is just a prettier vulnerability scanner. A contract officer cleared his throat mid-presentation. Interesting. How are the rollback procedures triggered on compromise detection? Ryan blinked, then stammered something about automated cascade dependencies, which isn't a real protocol, not in our system, not in any system I've ever architected. But no one challenged him. No one even looked concerned. Because when you're young, credentialed, and sponsored by someone high enough up the ladder, people nod through your nonsense like it's cutting-edge strategy. I sat there outside, invisible, while they let him dance around my decade of work like it was downloaded inspiration. He had copied my presentation perfectly. Slide transition, speaker notes, even my placeholder tactical slide near the end that says pause here, assess the threat landscape, then deploy countermeasures. I invented that rhythm. I made that cadence work for busy flag officers with 30-second attention spans. And he took it, wore it like a medal, and strutted into that room without hesitation. But here's the thing, Ryan didn't just steal a presentation. He impersonated a licensed, credentialed contractor on federal record, and every second he stayed logged in under my session. Every data point he accessed while masked behind my credentials was being tracked, mirrored, and stored on a separate partition. I designed it that way. When your framework is the backbone of a $45 million defense contract, you don't trust people to play fair. You build in silent tripwires. You code in federal alarm bells, and you keep your real files watermarked with signatures that don't disappear when someone tries to save as. I watched a few more minutes. He skipped the hardware compliance verification. Of course he did. That slide had been a placeholder anyway. The real content was encrypted behind a hyperlink that only opened if you were logged into my vault session. Ryan had my structure. He did not have my access. And soon that distinction was going to matter a lot. What Ryan didn't realize as he clicked through the most convincing performance of his short career was that federal compliance had already been looped in the moment he activated a clause-protected credential session from an unverified device. Which meant someone was on their way, not because I called them, because the contract required it. I took another measured sip of scotch, feeling the burn settle. Sometimes the best revenge is just letting the system work exactly as designed. They came in quiet. 2 of them. Federal compliance doesn't knock. They just materialize, all dark suits and badge clips like the air pressure shifted without warning. Ryan paused mid-sentence, hand frozen near the remote. The projection light caught the perspiration starting to form on his temple. He didn't smile this time, not even a twitch. "Excuse the interruption," said the taller one. "Agent Burton, I think." I'd seen him at 3 security briefings, always hovering near the compliance desk, always scanning the room like everyone owed him documentation. "We just have one question before this continues." He didn't sit down, didn't offer pleasantries, just raised a single printed page held between 2 fingers like evidence in a court-martial. "Who logged in under Victor Sullivan's credentials this morning?" Ryan blinked. You could almost hear the backpedaling spin up behind his eyes. "I was given access," he said, "for continuity purposes." I had to brief the contract board and someone from IT said someone. Agent Burton repeated slowly like the words tasted like perjury. He turned the page. According to federal logs, that session was launched at 3:47 a.m. from an unregistered device. It accessed protected framework assets tagged under custodial designation. Are you aware what that means? The silence that followed was the kind that makes even ventilation systems seem too loud. I adjusted my glass, not because I needed the scotch, because I didn't want to smirk. The shorter agent, Monica Reed, added without a hint of warmth, "That session isn't just protected, it's contractually firewalled under non-delegation protocol. Victor Sullivan isn't an employee. He's a licensed vendor under Sullivan Defense Systems. Access under his credentials constitutes breach of custodial terms under Clause 14C. Someone coughed. A chair creaked. One of the contract assistants reached to close their laptop like the hardware might incriminate them by proximity. Still, I didn't walk in. I didn't gloat. I just hit send on my tablet. A PDF, subject line, violation of custodial access terms, Clause 14C. The document was clean. Tom-stamped credential pings, token key activity logs, device fingerprint, hardware signature, even the back-end checksum that proved Ryan had tried to access the embedded compliance sandbox and failed twice. And at the bottom of the PDF, a cropped segment of the vendor agreement, highlighted Clause 14C. Non-delegation of access violation constitutes grounds for immediate federal remediation, including impersonation, credential sharing, and presentation of proprietary frameworks under alternate identity. Agent Burton glanced at his secure phone, presumably reading the attachment. then looked up at the room, expression unreadable. "No one here," he said slowly, "is authorized to present this material without Victor's written authorization. That includes derivatives." Ryan's voice cracked. "But I was told," Carl said. "We didn't think, you didn't read," Agent Reed replied. The VP seated near the wall looked like someone had just drained the color from his face. He didn't defend Ryan. He didn't even speak. He stared at the screen, at my screen, like he suddenly understood how deep a mistake had been made. I stood up from my bench and walked back toward the secure elevator. I didn't need to see the rest. My contract had already spoken. By 2 p.m., the entire facility felt different, like someone had sucked the oxygen out of the air and replaced it with nervous energy and unspoken questions. Desks were still occupied. Meetings were still on calendars, but no one was actually working. They were hovering, whispering, watching their inboxes like the apocalypse might arrive as a security alert. At 1:47 p.m., access to the validation modules froze. One by one, the dashboards began to lock, infrastructure staging, compliance checkpoints, even the internal deployment calendar. The go-no-go flags grayed out and pulsed with the message, pending custodial verification. No one really understood what that meant until finance tried to release the pre-deployment budget and got a system error tagged with my license ID. By 3:30 p.m., the federal contract Slack channel went dead. No updates, no decisions, just a long string of question marks and passive-aggressive emoji reactions. Then quietly, a new channel appeared. Project Phoenix Restart, created by one of Ryan's team leads. No invite sent to me. Of course not. This was damage control, a last-ditch effort to rewrite everything without touching the original framework. Too late. The framework wasn't just slides and bullet points. It was wired into every timeline, funding release, and compliance check in the building. They hadn't just stolen a PowerPoint. They'd tried to hijack the skeleton of an entire federal contract roadmap, and now that skeleton was crumbling. I didn't respond. I just watched my own devices, laptop, tablet, even my badge-linked secure terminal, auto-revoked from the network, like a protocol breathing out. That part wasn't punitive, it was pre-coded. Custodial revocation triggers when Clause 14C is breached, and it suspends all internal syncs until federal remediation is complete. It's not retaliation. It's protection. At exactly 4:04 p.m., the VP's dashboard, a private view linked to his executive suite login, flashed red across the top bar, custodial access suspended. Consult primary license holder. I'd heard from someone in procurement that he stood there blinking at the screen, mumbling something about system bugs until his assistant quietly slid a copy of the Sullivan Defense Systems Agreement across his desk. I imagine that moment felt like watching a controlled demolition in slow motion and realizing the charge you'd triggered was holding the entire structure together. Meanwhile, outside the boardroom chaos, Ryan had disappeared from the main Slack threads entirely. No posts, no comments, just radio silence, like he was hoping the facility would reset itself and federal records would erase the past 24 hours. They wouldn't. The system remembered, and so did everyone who now had to explain why infrastructure deployment had turned to static, why finance couldn't release funds, and why federal compliance kept citing a contract none of them had bothered to read until now. I rotated my scotch glass one more time, watching the amber catch the office light. Funny thing about being underestimated in this business. They ignore you when you're building the foundation, then panic when you take it with you. By end of day, the company's internal roadmap, months in federal review, wasn't just paused, it was paralyzed, and I hadn't even filed the formal claim yet. They called the emergency debrief for 8:30 a.m. sharp. No coffee, no pleasantries, no small talk. Just 12 people in a windowless conference room trying to defuse a bomb after it had already detonated. I didn't attend. Obviously, my contract didn't require me to, but I had sources in the room and digital ears, and more importantly, the framework had built-in compliance echo tags. Any slide presented without live credential ping triggered a passive log alert, so I knew exactly when the walls started closing in. The CTO opened the meeting with a question no one was prepared to answer. What happened to our deployment framework? Federal compliance didn't hesitate. That's the thing about agents. They never flinch when they know the paperwork is on their side. It's owned by Sullivan Defense Systems under custodial terms, Agent Burton said calmly, like he was reading off a manifest. Internal override isn't permitted. The breach triggered Clause 14C, activating auto-revocation of all dependent systems. The VP, Ryan's sponsor, Carl Newman, shifted in his chair like someone had just poured ice water down his back. Wait, he's just a consultant. You're saying we don't control our own framework? Agent Burton turned the page in his folder. He's not just anything, he's the licensee. That deck, that access protocol, the go-no-go module, all proprietary under custodial agreement. Those credentials can't be duplicated or reassigned without written authorization from Victor Sullivan or a Sullivan Defense-appointed delegate. Then he slid the paper across the table. It wasn't a threat, it was a receipt. The CEO leaned forward. So we're liable. Agent Reed nodded. Yes. Unauthorized use of a credentialed vendor's framework, especially under impersonation, constitutes federal breach. The breach originated from a device associated with Mr. Foster without credential delegation or prior written consent. You're looking at direct contractual violation. I was told. The CEO exhaled through his nose like he'd just swallowed a circuit board. Nobody said Ryan's name out loud after that. No one had to. He wasn't in the room. He hadn't shown up to work that morning, or the night before, or probably any time soon. Then Agent Burton brought out the evidence. A screenshot of my hash signature embedded like a watermark in the bottom right corner of the first slide. Not decorative, legal. Use requires live credential ping, non-transferable. That one line turned the room into a freezer. And if that wasn't enough, he followed with a summary email from Sullivan Defense Systems, time-stamped and archived, outlining the custodial framework agreement, the non-delegation clause, and a licensing summary showing that all deployment protocols were to be routed through my vault access only. In other words, they had no infrastructure, they had no compliance path, they had no federal green light to move a dime of funding. The only roadmap they had access to was mine, but they'd burned that bridge when they let Ryan use my name like a passkey and pretended it wasn't theft. And just like that, the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. You could practically hear the suits calculating how much this would cost, not just in dollars, but in reputation, federal standing, and the deployment timeline that had already been sent to Pentagon brass. The contract liaison finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper. Can we salvage this? Agent Burton didn't answer. He didn't have to because the answer wasn't his to give. By Wednesday morning, the platform was a digital graveyard. Every sync attempt failed. Every token pinged back, invalid session. Custodial lock engaged. Teams sat in front of their screens like technicians waiting for equipment that had already been decommissioned. Developers couldn't push code updates. Contract leads couldn't update deployment status. Even HR couldn't generate internal security clearance documents linked to the infrastructure module. The framework had been the spine of everything, and now it was a locked vault with no keys left in the building. Someone tried bypassing the sync by cloning an archived presentation. The system flagged it within 12 seconds and auto-triggered a compliance warning. Another developer tried pulling a partial export from 2 weeks ago. Same result. My code recognized the fingerprints. It knew the difference and it didn't forgive. I sat in my home office, Scotch glass steady on the desk, watching the facility's digital nervous breakdown unfold in real time. Every failed login attempt, every system timeout, every frustrated email thread. The beauty of building your own infrastructure is that you get to watch it defend itself. By noon, a notice went out across the facility-wide Slack. Administrative leave, Ryan Foster. No further comment at this time. They didn't even try to spin it. No PR statement. No stepping back to focus on other opportunities announcement. Just a digital vanishing act. He was gone. And the silence that followed said more than any press release ever could. The VP, his sponsor, waited until later that afternoon to send me an email. Long one. Apologetic, tried to thread the needle between we didn't realize and I had no idea he'd go that far. Said he respected my work, always had, and that he hoped we could reset the professional relationship. He didn't get a reply, because it wasn't my place to respond. That privilege, like everything else now, belonged to federal compliance, and they answered on Sullivan Defense letterhead. One sentence, clinical, and final. All custodial rights remain under existing contract. Ryan's statement requires renegotiation and license reacquisition. They attached an invoice. $67,000 payable on receipt. Line items, breach of custodial terms, unauthorized credential use, derivative exposure, and internal disruption fees. There were no appeals, no discounts. The line between consultant and infrastructure had finally registered. You don't impersonate the person holding the vault keys and expect to keep the lights on. I heard later that Carl, the VP, spent the rest of the week meeting with external counsel. He didn't return to the contract floor, couldn't look half the team in the eye. A few staffers even joked that the break room coffee tasted better without the designer cologne cloud hanging in the air. I didn't celebrate, didn't post, didn't need to. I just rotated my scotch glass one more time and watched the sun shift across my office carpet. The system had spoken, and everything they tried to rebuild now started from scratch with my signature still burned into the foundation they'd tried to steal. Outside my window, the city hummed along like nothing had happened. But inside that defense contractor facility, they were learning the hard way that some foundations can't be copied, only earned. The industry article dropped Friday morning like a quiet verdict. No fanfare, no flashy headlines, just a steady ripple through the channels that actually mattered. Defense contractor halts deployment amid custodial conflict. 7 words. No names, no blame, just enough detail to get every federal program manager in the Beltway to start whispering. They never named me, of course. Professional courtesy, federal accuracy, whatever excuse they used. It didn't matter. I didn't need credit. I already had custody. But the quote they pulled from compliance, that one resonated. When you build around a strategist's framework, read the fine print before you try to present it without them. I nearly adjusted my glass. Not because it was vindictive, because it was true. Because it was calm, final, and printed in black and white, with the authority of someone who wasn't just cleaning up a mess, but clarifying a law of physics. You don't get to skip the architect and still expect the building to stand. Someone forwarded me a screenshot of the article. There, nestled in the middle of the layout, was a photo of the presentation slide, cropped, pixelated, but still unmistakable. In the bottom right corner, barely visible, my hash signature, faded, but there like a whisper. Ryan deleted his LinkedIn that morning, not just deactivated, deleted. No soft exit, no new position listed, no redirect to a consulting role at some boutique firm, just gone, a blank space where his credential showcase used to be. The VP, Carl, didn't post either. Didn't reply to contract messages, didn't show up for a scheduled podcast interview about empowering next-generation leadership. Funny how quiet empowerment gets when it runs headfirst into a legally binding document. I watched all of it unfold from my home office. Same chair, same scotch, same security dashboard still open from earlier that week. Nothing in my world had shifted, but everything in theirs had crumbled. The deployment was still paused, the roadmap was still locked, and the trust they'd burned in one impulsive act would take years to rebuild, if it ever could. I didn't forward the article, didn't text it to anyone, didn't highlight anything in red. I just let it exist. Let it float out there where people would read it, raise their eyebrows, and wonder who the strategist was. Wonder what kind of system could be powerful enough to halt a multi-million-dollar federal contract with a single PDF. They could wonder all they wanted. I'd already written the next framework. And this time, the hash signature was bigger. He called me personally. No assistant, no scheduler, no federal buffer. Just the CEO of a multi-million-dollar defense contractor, voice softened by damage control and too many sleepless nights. I let it ring once before answering. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Victor, we want to make this right." He laid out the offer in the kind of careful tone men use when they finally realize the room no longer belongs to them. Formal advisory role, competitive salary, reset system access, direct reporting to the contract board, no middlemen, no gatekeeping, no Newman family interference. I listened, and then I thanked him and declined. No anger, no lecture, just a clean refusal. I told him I'd already moved on. Sullivan Defense Systems had several federal projects in flight, and my time was already allocated. I didn't explain further, I didn't owe him that. Instead, I recommended someone I trusted, a junior strategist I'd mentored from the ground up. Smart, steady, unshakably thorough. She'd shadowed my work for the last 18 months and knew the bones of the framework inside and out. Not to duplicate, to build forward. The CEO hesitated. Would she have the same level of access? No, I said plainly. She'll operate under escrow-verified access. You'll receive quarterly audits, no live session delegation, without written authorization. He paused but didn't protest. They'd learned their lesson the hard way. That afternoon, Sullivan Defense Systems issued a memo to the contract board, no fanfare, just facts. Effective immediately, all future strategic frameworks must pass through custodial validation protocol. No internal duplication permitted. Escrow-controlled systems will log all access activity. Breach of process voids indemnity. It was signed simply, V. Sullivan. That name carried weight now. Not because I'd shouted, but because when the building cracked, I was the one holding the blueprint. I heard later that federal compliance had started rewriting several of their vendor agreements. Not just for optics, for survival. They were rebuilding their internal policies around clarity, audit trails, and something new for them. Accountability. Good, let them build it right this time. I didn't need to be part of it. They'd already proven what happened when they thought they could cut corners around people like me, and I was done saving them from themselves. The infrastructure finally deployed 6 weeks late, stripped of half the features they'd promised at the contract review back in May, and loaded with just enough temporary fixes to hold together through Q1. They didn't announce it with fanfare. No live stream, no champagne toast, no big quote from the VP. Just a quiet blog post at midnight, buried between a security patch note and a federal disclaimer. Every page in the interface bore the same new footer. Built under custodial license, Sullivan Defense Systems, LLC. No internal duplication permitted. It wasn't a warning, it was a scar. Proof that even the most sophisticated platform needs a spine, and they'd tried to rip theirs out without checking where the nerves were attached. I watched the deployment status from my home office. One tab open for the federal dashboard, the other refreshing my escrow console. Everything checked out. Token pings clean, access logs intact. My framework was working just as intended, only now from a distance with all the safeguards I'd wished I didn't need. About 40 minutes into the deployment briefing, the CEO was asked a question by some moderator trying to be clever, that compliance issue before launch. "What's the big takeaway?" He paused, looked down at his notes, then back at the conference room. Turns out, he said slowly, strategy isn't just slides, it's ownership. That was it. No name drop, no backstory. Just the sound of someone who finally understood the price of assumptions. I didn't comment in the chat. Didn't email him afterward. Didn't need to. I closed the dashboard, shut the laptop, scotch still untouched. The sun had started to shift across the carpet in that long, soft way it does right before afternoon truly settles. Somewhere in the city, they were probably congratulating themselves for salvaging the deployment. But they knew. Every one of them knew. This time, I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't stormed a room. I hadn't filed lawsuits or gone on LinkedIn rants. I just revoked access, and they had to rebuild around what was left, not out of spite, out of principle. You don't get to impersonate authority and keep the benefits. You don't get to steal trust and expect silence. You don't get to cut corners around custodianship and pretend it was an accident. I rotated my scotch glass one final time, watching the amber catch the afternoon light streaming through my office window. The weight of it felt right in my palm. Familiar, real. If they'd asked, I might have helped, but they took, so I revoked. In the end, they learned what every good contractor knows. The person who builds the foundation decides when the building stands.